Okay, let's go ahead and copy the definition of heredity on your vocab sheet. Pause the video, take a moment to write it in. Now let's think about this definition. What kind of characteristics are we talking about being passed from one generation to another? You may also think of these as traits. Your hair color is a characteristic passed to you from the previous generation. So is your eye color, your height, and even the way you fold your hands together when you cross them. Heredity may remind you of the word inherit. You are inheriting these traits or characteristics from the generation before you. But who is that? That's right, we're talking about your parents. And who did they inherit their characteristics from? Write down a few more examples of characteristics that someone will inherit from their parents. We will share out in class. The next vocabulary word is gene. Copy down the definition in your notes. The definition for heredity told us that characteristics are passed genetically. You probably have already figured out that means characteristics are passed on your DNA. The part of the DNA that codes for the characteristic is called a gene. So you would say that you have a gene for eye color or a gene for hair color. I would say that I have inherited the awesome gene. How else would you explain my awesomeness? What are some other genes that you have? Lastly, copy down the definition for genetics in your notes. Take a minute to explain in your notes why this definition makes sense based on the first two vocab words you just learned. Connect genetics back to heredity and genes to explain this. We know that genes are a part of the DNA that code for a characteristic or trait. But wait a minute. There are different versions of each characteristic. Not all eyes are brown. Not all hair is blonde. So what will we call those different versions or forms of a gene? That's right, alleles. Do you have the allele for brown eyes? The allele for blue eyes? Or do you have a different allele for the eye color? You know that you have two copies of every gene for a characteristic. Think, where did you inherit them from? Your mom passed you one allele and your dad passed you another allele. They may have given you the same allele, but what if they each gave you a different allele? Say mom gave you the allele for brown eyes and dad gave you the allele for blue eyes. Which color eyes will you end up with? The answer is in your next two definitions. The dominant allele will always be shown or expressed over the recessive allele. Remember, things that are dominant always win. The only way to show a recessive characteristic is if both mom and dad give you the recessive allele. So there is no dominant allele to be shown. Let's stick with eye color and look at an example. The brown allele is dominant over the blue allele. What if one parent gives the child the brown allele, which is represented by big or uppercase B, and the other parent gives the child the allele for blue eyes, which is represented by little or lowercase b? The child will now have a brown eye allele and a blue eye allele. What color eyes will the child have? That's right, brown. The child will show the dominant color. If you're not sure why, rewind and watch the previous slide.
As you've learned from our lessons on meiosis, gametes are reproductive cells, egg and sperm, which contain half the number of chromosomes. The term genotype refers to the genetic makeup of an individual, which is represented by symbols of alleles. Examples are big B, big B, little b, and little b, little b. And phenotypes are the physical characteristics or trait that is expressed by that genotype. For example, blue eyes, brown eyes. What are some of your phenotypes? Jot these down next to your notes. Look at this picture. Which is the genotype and which is the phenotype? Big B and big B, little b and little b are the genotypes, and brown eyes and blue eyes are both phenotypes, or the way those genes are expressed. A homozygous organism has two identical alleles, both dominant or both recessive for a particular trait. The prefix homo means the same, so you can remember it that way. For example, two big B's are homozygous dominant, two little b's are homozygous recessive. A heterozygous organism has two different alleles for the same trait. If big B is for brown eyes and little b is for blue eyes, which allele do you think would be expressed? Remember, hetero means different, while homozygous means the same.
We should take a couple minutes and give credit where credit is due. Does anybody know who this man is? He's considered the father of genetics.
Gregor Mendel was born in 1822. He worked as a gardener and a beekeeper, but eventually became a high school teacher in a monastery. In the 1850s, he conducted experiments on the genetics of pea plants. He worked on pea plants, which earned him the title founder of the modern science of genetics. This image shows the characteristics or traits of the pea plants that Mendel was studying. They include seed shape, seed color, flower color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, and stem height.
So, Mendel took his pea plants to explain the patterns of genetics. He used simple symbols with his genotypes to represent the different phenotypes. Take a minute to go back to your definitions of genotype and phenotype. Remember that genotype are the genes or the letters, and phenotypes are the physical description of the genes. So Mendel chose the letter T to represent height. Capital T represents being tall and is dominant over being dwarf or short. Dwarf is the recessive phenotype and is represented by a lowercase t. Similarly, Mendel chose the letter Y to represent seed color. Capital Y represents being yellow and is dominant over being green. Green is the recessive phenotype and is represented by a lowercase y. In Mendel's experiments, he had similar plants that were only allowed to self-pollinate. These plants were homozygous for each trait and only produced offspring that were identical to themselves. For example, tall plants produced only tall offspring. Dwarf plants produced only dwarf offspring. Then, Mendel wanted to expand his plant genetics experiments and cross plants with different traits to see what would happen. This creates a hybrid. Write the definition for hybrid on your vocabulary sheet. Hybrids are organisms resulting from the crosses with different traits. You could relate a genetic hybrid to a hybrid car that runs on both electricity and gas, or like hybrids in the Vampire Diaries, where a hybrid is considered half vampire, half werewolf. You could have different types of genetic hybrids. Monohybrids is the crossing of one trait, and dihybrid is the crossing of two traits. Remember that the prefix mono means one, and the prefix di means double or two. On the vocabulary sheet, fill in the number of traits for monohybrid and dihybrid. If you're interested, type in the link in your internet browser if you'd like to see how Mendel actually crossed his plant traits. Mendel needed to create a system to track his crosses from one generation to the next without getting them confused. The plants in the original cross, for example, a purebred crossing a purebred, is considered the P generation. On your vocabulary sheet, write down that the P generation always represents the parental generation. In this example, Mendel crossed a purebred yellow pea plant and a purebred green pea plant, and this is considered the pea generation. Moving forward, remember that when we use the word purebred, we mean that they are homozygous for a trait. On your vocabulary sheet, write down that purebred equals homozygous. At this time, I'd also like you to write down 2 examples of what homozygous genotypes might look like for plant height. Use the letter A to represent the alleles. To wrap up this slide, the results of the pea generation cross are the first generation of plants created. They are called the F1 generation or the first filial generation. On your vocabulary sheet, write down that F1 generation means the first generation results of the original cross. In the example, Mendel crossed 2 peas from the F1 generation. The resulting peas were considered the F2 generation. Think about how we ended up with 3 yellow peas and 1 green pea. How could this be possible?
Alright, so we're going to talk about 2 different laws that Mendel came up with in regards to genetics. The first one is called the law of segregation. In this law, Mendel suggested that the parents would each donate only 1 allele for a trait to the F1 or the first generation. He called this segregation. Here we see an example. If Mendel crossed a homozygous tall plant, big T, with a homozygous dwarf plant, little t, what might the offspring look like? Let's take a closer look. You can see the first pure tall plant is on the left with big T. The segregation occurs when they make their gametes. This parent only has dominant traits or tall alleles, so each of its gametes can only receive big T's. And the dwarf plant on the right can only donate little t's to its gametes. Therefore, all of the offspring in the first or the F1 generation will have 1 big T and 1 little t. Because tall is dominant, all of the offspring will appear or look tall. It's not until the F2, or the third generation, that you can actually see the recessive dwarf trait in 1 out of 4 offspring. The second law Mendel coined is called the law of independent assortment. Mendel suggested that genes for different traits are inherited separately or independently of each other. He called this independent assortment. Here's what this means. Because chromosomes separate from each other during meiosis, the genes that end up in each gamete at the end are random, and therefore so are the combinations of traits. For example, just because it's common that individuals who have blue eyes also have blonde hair, that's not always the case. Like Courtney Cox. She has blue eyes and brown hair. This is because the genes for eye color and hair color are inherited independently of each other, hence independent assortment. And now that your genetics lingo is profesh, let's practice setting up a Punnett square example to demo a cross. If we cross a homozygous brown, big B, haired individual with a heterozygous brown-haired individual, big B, little b, the first thing you need to do is separate the alleles and place 1 letter on the outside of the Punnett square above the boxes. Then separate the other individuals' alleles and put them on the side. Next, we need to fill in the boxes. I use the saying, drop it down and slide to the side. So what I mean by this is that you need to take the top 2 letters and drop them down into the boxes. And then we take the side alleles and slide to the side. The possible offspring are now in each box of the Punnett. So you can see 50% have big B, or are homozygous, and then 50% are big B, little b, or heterozygous. I want you to fill in your Punnett square, and then also right below your Punnett, tell me what percentage of the individuals or the possible offspring will have brown hair or blonde hair.
How neat is that? That's pretty neat.